So tonight I'm gonna talk a bit about what lies beyond Twitter and what the future might look like if Twitter goes away or something happens to Twitter, and what might happen in the upcoming next 10 years. But before we go into any of the details, I think it's time to actually congratulate Twitter, because 2 days ago Twitter had its 10th birthday, and when talking about startups and talking about internet companies, the 10th birthday is a really rare sight, and that really shows that Twitter has created something unique and valuable for a lot of people. So really great achievement and something to really congratulate them for. But with this 10th birthday also came some worries. Quite a few of us noticed this hashtag going across the Twitterverse a while back. Is Twitter about to die? Is this the end? A lot of people were talking about the end of Twitter being close by, and that, yeah, the story would soon come to an end. And why was that? Well, Twitter no longer had any growth. And since Twitter is a startup, despite being 10 years old, it's still a startup, and a startup with no growth is essentially dead in the Silicon Valley way of looking at things. You need to grow or else you're not alive. And since Twitter no longer has any growth, it still has a huge user base, but that user base is not growing in any large relative numbers. Hence, Twitter is practically dead in startup terms. But that wasn't enough, because when Twitter had these numbers, Twitter itself started to think, what can we do to fix these problems? And they started thinking in terms of an algorithm. What? Twitter is usually a real-time feed of updates. You get status updates in real time. That has been the way that Twitter has always worked. But all of a sudden, Twitter went, we should have an algorithm. We should decide for you what content that you are interested in. To handle what they felt was the biggest problem, the biggest obstacle to user growth, the fear of missing out, that people wouldn't use the platform because they wouldn't see it as usable, because they would have to spend too much time to keep up with all of the new content, and there would be too much noise and too little value. So Twitter went, we need to build an algorithm. We need to become more Facebookish, because Facebook apparently does something that works. Facebook has an algorithm. A question? Why would Twitter want to do that algorithm? What's their motivation behind it? Well, they don't have any growth, so they're basically dead. They need to get some growth so that they are not dead. And who else has growth and are very much alive? Well, Facebook are very much alive, so Twitter has to do a Facebook. But for all of us that loves Twitter, we don't want Twitter to become Facebook. We love that Twitter isn't a filter bubble, but that Twitter is actually the raw, real-time stream of content that we can consume ourselves, and that we ourselves can decide upon what we think is interested and not interested. So to all of us Twitter fans, this meant that for us, Twitter was about to kill itself. And as if that wasn't enough, Twitter went, oh, 140 characters. 140 characters. Who can have a sensible conversation in 140 characters? 140 characters is far too few characters to make a reasonable argument. So maybe we should raise it up to 10,000. Maybe that will fix our growth problem. Maybe that will make us alive again. But to all of us who loves Twitter, Twitter is 140 characters. That's the raw spirit of Twitter. That's what actually makes Twitter great. So once again, Twitter was trying to make itself alive by basically killing itself. So with all of this, we could ask, what's really happening? What's happening with Twitter? One could ask oneself, is Twitter really losing its tweetiness? Is Twitter becoming something else? Is Twitter really going away? And if Twitter is going away, what about us? What about us tweeters? What do we do if Twitter goes away? Do we really have an option? Do we really have an option if Twitter is no more? Twitter is the only remaining microblog. So for us that loves microblogs, I think that microblogs actually add something useful for us that loves this real-time stream of raw thoughts and ideas from people. Do we have an option if Twitter goes away or if Twitter transforms into something that isn't Twitter anymore? And we can ask ourselves the question, how do we ensure that the format of Twitter and the microblog itself actually remains even if Twitter goes away? Because can we really rely on Twitter to tweet, or do we have to take the matter of tweeting into our own hands to ensure that we can still tweet even in the future, even if Twitter is dying because it has no growth, even if Twitter transforms into becoming the next Facebook by adding algorithms and by adding longer messages? Yes? There isn't any other microblogs of any reasonable size. There has been other microblogs like Jaiku that had a reasonable size, but Google bought them and didn't go that well. So there is no big alternative. And I will come back to that a bit later, but it's basically because with Metcalfe's law and the law about powers in networks and the values in network, that increases exponentially with the size of a network, and thus, as Twitter is the biggest network, Twitter has kind of monopolized the network space because nothing can come even close to the power of Twitter, because you have, by just being half the size of Twitter, you are far than half you have far less than half the value of Twitter. So it's kind of impossible to keep up with these big networks. If I could, I would probably.
Because I have an idea, because I stopped using Twitter. I still do sometimes use it, but I realized that a lot of people are posting photos and links to videos. So now, I was thinking, so I can just use Instagram.
Yeah.
So I turned to
Yeah.
Instagram instead of Twitter.
And what I kind of observed is that people, for now, it's more that people are broadcasting things, and it's less about conversations and all of that. But yeah, it is still very many people that loves Twitter, and Twitter still has a very special place in each and every one of our hearts. And for now, this is just Twitter. It's Twitter that at the point where it might be about to die. People are raising the question: is Twitter about to die? And what do we do if Twitter is dying? I mean, for the Swedish microblog community, Jaiku already died once. We have already had our major microblog die, and then we went to Twitter, and now we're seeing that, oh, maybe the same thing is happening to us again, but now we don't have anything else to go to. When Jaiku died, we could go to Twitter. Now we have no second option. But I may show that we perhaps still do. We perhaps still have a second option. But the same could still happen to like Facebook and Instagram. Those can still die, but Facebook is unfortunately going a bit too well to have any dying on the horizon. But before I move into looking at how Twitter went about to be what it is and what might lie beyond Twitter, we would just like to tell you a bit about who I am. My name is Pelle Wessman, and I'm a freelance web developer based here in Malmö. And I've been part of building a couple of social web platforms before, like Flutter and Bloglovin. And I'm a member of the IndieWeb community, and I was also an early adopter of many of the microblogs and social web apps out there, like Jaiku, Twitter, Goala, Foursquare, Instagram, and all of those. But let's take a look at how Twitter came to be. Because before Twitter, it wasn't darkness. Before Twitter, we still had social networks. Twitter and microblogs wasn't the first of social networks. Before Twitter and Jaiku and all of the other microblogs, we had the Blogosphere. And Twitter kind of grew out of the Blogosphere. When we looked at the Blogosphere back in the day, back in 2008, we could read headlines in newspapers like, blog storm against FRA law and media coverage of FRA law. This was the outrage of the day. Like, this new blogosphere dares to rage against FRA law and engage the media establishment. It dares to question how the media covers the new FRA surveillance laws, and we got headlines about the blog storm against that. This is very similar to how we can get headlines today about the Twitter storms. And when we see headlines about Twitter storms today, we think that that's something what is unique to Twitter, but it's something that actually came with the blogosphere and came with the democratization of publishing that came with the Web 2.0 movement. So let's take a bit of a look at what the blogosphere that existed before Twitter actually was, and what things that actually existed back then. So we had the blog storms around the controversies that is very similar to the tweet storms that we can see nowadays. We also had blogging of reactions to events. Like yesterday when we had the terrorist attacks in Belgium, and Twitter was just flooded with outrage and disgust against those terrorist acts. It feels like something that is unique to Twitter and something that we won't see on non-social web platforms. But actually back in the day when the same terrorist attacks happened in London, it wasn't to Twitter or Facebook that people went to express their outrage or their disgust. It was to the blogs. It was on the blogs that people shared their reactions. It was on the blogs that people shared the information, the very same information that people today share on Twitter. And this was due to the Web 2.0 movement that happened back in the early 2000th century after the IT bubble, where we had a democratization of content creation and we had a flooding of user participation. And out of that then grew the microblogging community. Back then we had things that we now think of as unique to Twitter. Like, you can search hashtags on Twitter and see all of the content surrounding a specific event. And now the very latest feature, the Twitter moments, where the Twitter themselves gather content that's unique to a specific happening. We think that that might be unique to Twitter and Facebook and all of the new social medias, but we actually had it back in the day with Technorati, Knuff, and Twingly, which aggregated content around aggregated blog posts around specific content, so we could see who is blogging about a specific book, who is blogging about a specific event. In the case of these terrorist attacks yesterday, we could see all of the content that surrounded that specific topic, so we could gather it in one place and actually get this blogosphere community like we have a Twitter community today. And it was very personal and collaborative. It was a single community that worked together, just like we have on Twitter today. But then this happened. The microblogs came along. And in Sweden, Twitter wasn't the first microblog to emerge. It was actually this, Jaiku, a Finnish microblogging platform that actually would have had its 10th birthday last month. It was actually a month older than Twitter. And this grew really, really big. And it was majorly thanks to this, the mobile phones, because this is prior to the iPhone. And what Jaiku did that the blogosphere didn't do is that Jaiku put itself in your pocket. You could install it on the Nokia S60 and get all of your contacts in the phone. You could post updates to everyone else's phones from your pocket, and this was revolutionary back then. I mean, we can take a look at this blog post from Mashable in August 17th of 2007, where they say radical things like, as long as your phone is on, Jaiku is running. That is pretty radical. And you could post from your phone. I mean, this new app from Jaiku is pretty amazing. And nowadays that feels pretty natural, but that was actually around the same time as Steve Jobs said this, that every once in a while a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything. And this was Steve Jobs announcing the first iPhone, and that was released in June, the same year as Mashable wrote that other blog post. And the first iPhone didn't have any apps. It didn't have any push notifications. It just had a web browser, a phone, an address book, and a couple of other basic things. So we didn't have a real mobile first way of thinking about things. So the microblogs was actually the very first mobile-first group of services. It was in the very early days of the smartphone, or even before the smartphones, when the standard feature phones got the web access. Back then, they became the very first mobile-first services to emerge, and that was kind of what they had as an they had as an edge towards the blogosphere. That all of a sudden you didn't have to sit in front of your computer to share articles. You could share status updates as you went along out in the real world. And that was microblogs in the beginning, but then microblogs adapted to users. They identified usage patterns along the way and eliminated pain points. Especially Twitter was very, very good at this, because as Twitter first emerged, the reason that Twitter has a 140 character limit is because Twitter worked with SMS. You could, for a very long time, I don't know if you still can do it, but you could tweet through SMS. And then you had to, of course, add some metadata and additional extras. So in all, you could only use 140 characters for the actual Twitter message. But then people started using it in different ways. This is a pretty classic tweet from Chris Messina, where he humbly suggested that perhaps we should just use this pound sign to annotate our posts and tag them. And this was what later became the hashtag. But back then, nothing like the hashtag actually existed. It was just Chris Messina suggesting that maybe we should use the pound sign to signify that we tag something in a specific way. And then later on, Twitter identified this pattern and standardized it. So now when I took this screenshot yesterday, we see that it's highlighted as an actual search. But that's just Twitter that identified that pattern and made it easier for people to use. And in the same way, Twitter actually didn't have a real search engine when it all began. Twitter actually bought their search engine from a third-party company. A third-party company called Sumice built a search engine for Twitter. They consumed the Twitter firehose and built a search engine where you could search for tweets from users, search for specific hashtags, and all of that. And Twitter bought it because they realized that it was very useful and that it could build very powerful things on top of it. And just as a interesting little side note, that was actually one of the first things that I did when I got Twitter. I built a Swedish website called svpt.nu. Yeah. It followed the hashtag SVPT, which stands for Swedes on Twitter, because that was about the time when the Swedish microblog community realized that Jaika was dead and everyone moved over to Twitter, but then we couldn't find each other on Twitter. But then we could build very easy build sites like this that actually followed the Twitter the tweets that was tagged with this hashtag in real time. So it was a real-time feed of everything tagged with this hashtag, so that people could find other Swedes on Twitter. And this was built in 4 hours during a Christmas leave, and is actually still one of my most successful mashups. So it shows the power in Twitter adapting and identifying and adapting itself to specific usage patterns. And they continue with it. In November 6th of 2009, Twitter posted a post where they activated a little feature called retweet to very small percentages of accounts in order to see how it works in the wild. I think it worked pretty well. Retweet is now a pretty crucial part of Twitter. I think people more or less retweets more than they tweet themselves. And retweets actually existed before Twitter implemented these native retweets, but before you have to do it manually, and you have to pre-quote a tweet, like copy a tweet and prefix it with the username and the characters RT. So it was really a usage pattern that was invented by users, but that Twitter made easier to use, because when you copied it, if you copied a long tweet that was around 140 characters, and then you needed to prepend the username and the RT words, then it wouldn't fit. So people that tweeted would have to ensure that they didn't use all of the 140 characters, because then they couldn't be retweeted and all of that. But Twitter solved it by just doing it natively, so that all tweets could be retweeted no matter how long or short they are. So just comparing the blogosphere to the Twitter sphere, there are some things that existed in both. So we had trackbacks, pingbacks back in the blogosphere that became mentions and replies. We had shared links back in the blogosphere that became retweets and then native retweets. And we have tags back in the blogosphere that became hashtags. So there are similarities between the blogosphere and the microblog sphere. It's really an evolvement from one to the other. And that's kind of a natural progress that we see from a desktop-oriented blogging system to a mobile-first blogging system. And kind of when we see development, we can look at development as kind of a TikTok development. When I made this slide yesterday, Intel hadn't still announced that they are abandoning TikTok, so this slide made much more sense yesterday than it does today. But Intel, the big processor manufacturer, they have usually, up until today, used a TikTok development scheme where every other new processor they add new features. And every other new processor, they refine the production of those features. So they don't do everything at once. They add new features, and then they refine it. So they have a cycle between discovery of new features and refining of new features. And I kind of think that this applies to the development that we see in the blogosphere and the microblogging sphere as well, where we can see Twitter as the discovery cycle. Twitter discovered new usage patterns. They discovered new new ways to apply user experience for microblogging onto the mobile world, like discovering usage patterns in the mobile world that was needed to do microblogging in a good way. And we have yet to see the refining of that. So we can see the blogosphere as a tick to the old news media. Old news media was controlled by the big media sites, wasn't democratized at all, and along the way came the blogosphere and added new features, added user participation, and added all of the things that Web 2.0 was about. And then nowadays, we can't really separate between blogs and old news media because they've kind of merged. We have seen the talk in when old news media has adopted many of the features of the blogosphere and refined themselves with that, and same thing with the blogosphere. But with microblogs, we haven't seen that cycle back. We haven't seen the refined cycle for the microblogging sphere. Yes, we have just seen Twitter exploring usage patterns for a smartphone era, but we haven't yet seen the refining and spreading of those experiences from that. We haven't seen those usage patterns go back to the blogosphere or go back to like the common space. But one can see some trends. There has been a resurgence in blogging, so one can see an indication of a trend towards this refining step coming back. People are kind of losing their patience with Twitter. People are kind of feeling an urge for making an artistic expression for themselves, like designing their own profiles, designing their own profiles, own pages. Like mostly artists are kind of fed up with having these very generic profile pages of Facebook and Twitter, and they want to have their own space where they can express themselves. And we're also seeing business people wanting to own their own presence online and don't want to be dependent on Twitter profiles, don't want to be dependent on Facebook profiles for their presence online, but rather want to own their own space. Because that just makes business sense for them. When Facebook changes some of the terms and all of a sudden you have to pay to reach your audience or something like that, it's a risk factor that small business entrepreneurs can't really afford. And then we're also seeing the same with activists. Activists have activists, or even museum, if we see museum as activists, have some problems with for example, images that Facebook and other social media might not really like. So if they want to really express themselves in the way that they feel they want to express themselves, then we have seen a resurgence in blogging where people can do things their own way without having a moral police look after, like interfere with their expression. So an indication that things might start moving in the other direction, but things hasn't yet done that. But let's take a look at the future of the microblog. If we want to ensure that the microblog remains, even if Twitter goes away, then we need something that is sustainable. But we also need something that, of course, is exciting. And to ensure that we have something that's both sustainable and exciting, there are a few certain things that we need. We need to have plurality and diversity within that new microblogging space. Facebook and Twitter has shown the way for a very long time, but they are far from exhausted all of the options that are out there. By ensuring that there's a lot more plurality and diversity amongst microblogging solutions, we can ensure that we have a lot more sustainable future, and most importantly, a lot more exciting future. But even more importantly, we need to allow for innovation and experimentation. We have had Facebook algorithms for a long time, we have had Twitter timelines for a long time, but we need to go beyond that and try out new ways of interacting with the content of the microblogging sphere. We need to find new ways to interact with one another, and we need to ensure that we ourselves can, that each and every one of us can do that. We need human aspects in all of this. We need to respect people's differences to enable true change to happen. Social media should be governed by each and every one of us and not be a single platform ruled by a single party. We really need to take the human aspect into it all. But perhaps most importantly, we need to empower people to create their own solutions. And this is kind of coming back to the Metcalfe's law thing, that right now we're kind of held hostages by the big social media networks, because through their size, the power and the value that resides in the size of their networks makes it impossible for any other network to try to rival them, because the value of every alternative network would be so small compared to these bigger networks because of the exponential value that comes with the size of network. So we need to empower people to build new solutions by enabling them to hook into existing networks rather than having to rebuild the network from scratch each and every time. And only by doing that, and only by empowering people to hook into existing networks rather than building new networks, can we actually ensure that we get the diversity that we need, get the innovation that we need, get the experimentation that we need. So empowerment is really, truly key. And this has been thought about for quite a long time. I mean, there are quite a few examples that has failed in this space. So you asked before about other microblogs, and there has been a lot of other microblogs. There's been StatusNet, or Identica, as it was also called, and that based itself on a standard called OStatus. But that became kind of a monoculture. The only ones that implemented the OStatus protocol was StatusNet and Identica, more or less. There was one other system that also implemented it, but that was venture capital financed, and when the venture capital went dry, they had to shut down, and we were left with only a single implementation that later on also shut down, and that era was closed. We have Diaspora that did a quite famous Kickstarter for quite a few years ago, where they were going to build a free and independent and decentralized network. But unlike StatusNet and Identica, they didn't even bother with defining an open standard for it. OStatus was an open standard that everyone could do independent implementations of, but Diaspora didn't even have that. They only had their own code base and was as such a monoculture that it never really had any chance of getting any traction. I mean, if you wanted to experiment with something, if you wanted to try out some new idea, then the only thing you could do with Diaspora was to actually modify their own code base. You couldn't then sit down and invent something new. And if you talk to programmers, then trying to get them to use some other people's tool rather in perhaps some other people's coding language, then you won't have much luck. People want to do things their own way with their own tools and not be dependent on some other people's code bases. And then we have kind of like the biggest approach that has, as far as I'm concerned, failed, and that's the linked data approaches. There are quite a few academic approaches to these decentralized networks that tries to kind of rebuild the web from scratch and try to make everything semantic and everything understandable by computers. But that's kind of like saying that we need to replace the entire internet to solve the problems that we have with Twitter owning the social web. And rebuilding the entire internet is kind of a big thing and not really something that you do overnight, and not really something that you can make a business case out of. You can't really go to your boss and say, hey, I thought that we should rebuild our entire website in linked data and that should make things amazing in about 25 years time if everyone else does it. There's really no business case to be made. It's just academically it's really fascinating, but in the real world it doesn't really make much sense as far as I'm concerned. And this really comes down to the classic debate of evolution versus revolution. The linked data approach is a revolutionary approach where we should replace the current web with an alternative semantic web. Whereas, for example, StatusNet was an approach that took a more evolutionary approach. But the thing that I'm going to look at in a couple of slides, the IndieWeb movement takes an even further, takes the evolutionary step even further, and kind of applies progressive enhancement techniques to creating a decentralized open replacement for Twitter. And it does so through a couple of principles. So let's take a look at those first. The IndieWeb follows a couple of principles to ensure that the evolutionary approaches will be accessible to everyone and assure that all of these things that I said before about empowerment and diversity and all that is that it lives up to all of that and actually creates a sustainable new decentralized social network. And the first principle is that you should own your data. The true key to empowerment is that you need to own it yourself. If someone else owns it, then you can't really, it's not really yours to touch. They can just deny your access.
What kind of data do you mean?
Well, in the microblogging sphere, it's your status updates and your profile.
So what does that mean?
That you shouldn't have it residing within Twitter. You shouldn't be dependent on Twitter servers being alive to have your tweets and your profile info, because then if Twitter dies, you're out of luck. If Twitter goes away today, you won't have any tweets anymore. You won't even have a profile. If your whole microblog identity revolves around your Twitter nickname and twitter.com isn't anymore, then you won't have even a nickname anymore. You won't really have an identity on the web anymore. So kind of key is that you need to own your data, or else you're not really able to experiment independently. And that kind of goes in hand with the next principle, that you should build tools for yourself. If you have your own data, then you can build tools that interact with that data, and you can build whatever tools that you want because you won't be limited to any terms of services or anything. Anyone that has tried to build something on top of Twitter and Facebook knows that the most common challenge isn't a technical challenge. The most common challenge with building against one of those big social networks is challenges with the terms of services. It's kind of a business challenge that you need to comply with their instructions, or else they can just ban you at their own will. And even if you comply with their instructions, they probably have somewhere in their terms that they can ban you at their will anyhow. The next principle is that you should eat your own dog food. You should build things that solves your own problems and not try to solve other problems that you might not know anything about. The best person for you to solve things for is yourself. And one of the reasons for this is, again, with the Metcalfe's law. Until we have a big decentralized network that everyone can hook into, then there won't be a very powerful. It will always be a better option to go to Twitter until there's a big separate independent network, because the value of the Twitter network will always be bigger. You can't convince, if you build your own little network consisting of you and your friends, you will have a hard time convincing your friends that it would be better to join that network than to actually join Twitter. But for you and yourself, it can be more useful. You can build tools for yourself that is more useful, because you yourself isn't dependent on your network. And that also comes hand in hand with something that we will see later, that the IndieWeb actually augments the existing networks and builds on top of them rather than trying to throw it away. Kind of this progressive enhancement approach. The IndieWeb also puts a lot of focus on documenting your stuff so that people can iterate it on it over time, and they put a lot of focus on the UX and design, and it's more important to solve the usability and the design than to solve actual technical challenge. Because if you don't have the usability and design there, then nobody will use your tools anyhow. So even if you build a lot of even if you solve a lot of cool and interesting technical challenges, if you don't do it in a way that people actually would want to use, then you haven't really solved anything. And you should build for longevity. When I researched this presentation and found all of these old blog posts from 2007 and 2008, 2009, I was actually kind of amazed, because when you go to your classic newspaper and try to find an article that's more than 2 years old, you will often fail. But for example, in the blogosphere, you can find blog posts that are about as old as Twitter. And actually on Twitter, you can find the very first tweet on Twitter. And you should kind of build with that in mind. You shouldn't build something that you throw away. You should build for the long term, at least according to the IndieWeb principles. And build for plurality, and then of course just have fun. If it isn't fun, who will do it anyway? And there's a full list on the IndieWeb Camp wiki for this. But basically, what's the core of IndieWeb is that it invites everyone. There is no formal process, as long as these principles are just a guideline, and to get this true diversity, unlike StatusNet and the other monocultures, it invites anyone to participate in and experiment with even the smallest of contributions. There's nothing. It's very rare that you see someone in the IndieWeb space say that someone else's contribution is wrong, or that someone else shouldn't do something. As long as people tries to experiment and tries to contribute to something better, the IndieWeb applauds that and encourages that. And also, of course, this focus on design and focus on usability rather than technical plumbing for the sake of plumbing. Because after all, even if you have very nice plumbing, if it's showing and you don't really have a good, nice looking surface on it, then you have pretty much failed after all. And I think there are some similarities between these IndieWeb principles and the ethical design manifesto that Laura and Errol presented at Creative Mornings this other week, where they also put a lot of effort, a lot of emphasis on making things usable and making things delightful, and putting in emphasis on human experience and human effort, and not just on what most of the new microblog alternatives has focused on in the past, which is to make things technically work. We need all of these three pieces to make things work. But this isn't the IndieWeb, but it's similar to it. Okay, so the pizzas are here, so let's just go quickly through how we can rebuild the microblog. So there's a couple of social dimensions that we need to be part of rebuilding the microblog from scratch. We have the publishing part. That's kind of obvious. It was the blog back in the day. Now you do it, publish on Twitter. We have a reader part. That's also kind of obvious. You need to publish something and you need to read something. That's kind of essential to any publishing tool. And back in the day, we used WordPress and Blogger to blog and publish our blog posts. We used Feedbeam, Feedly, and Google Reader to read the blog posts. And kind of today, we use Tweetbot or other clients on the iPhone to read the tweets. And Twitter and Tumblr and Jaiku themselves are kind of in this middle space where they are both a reader and a publisher. But then there's also the aggregator part, which is kind of essential. And we had, I mean, now I haven't even listed it here, but we have Product Hunt, Reddit, and Hacker News, Dig as well, which is kind of aggregators that where you can find stuff outside of the people that you follow. And of course, Google is one of the greatest aggregators. They crawl the entire web and aggregate content from all over the place. And back in the blogosphere, we had Knuff and Technorati. Knuff was the Swedish Technorati, and it's actually still alive. And it of course aggregated content around specific topics that could find what was trending in the blogosphere. And kind of interesting to notice that there are, in these intersections, there are some services like Flipboard, Apple News, and Bloglovin, which I worked on before, which is kind of a reader and an aggregator in one. And maybe there are some services that are in the intersection between an aggregator and a publisher as well. Some people have suggested that Medium might be such a service, but Medium is also a reader for some, so it's kind of hard to know. And for many of these newer services like Twitter, Medium, and perhaps even Flipboard Blog, I mean, all of these kind of try to implement all of these parts, but when it comes to an independent service, it doesn't always make sense to implement it all in one. But for Twitter and such, for them it makes sense to implement everything in the same app. But if you have an open system, it doesn't make as much sense. But of course, there's one service that implements it all, and that's Facebook. It implements everything and some more. It's apart from being all of this, it's your address book and your event calendar and a couple of more things. It's now also virtual reality, I don't know. But these are the three main aspects that I see that you have to solve. When you talk about IndieWeb with people, that you always get questions about one of these parts, like, okay, but how do I search all of IndieWeb posts, or how do I read the IndieWeb post, or how do I publish new IndieWeb posts? And people kind of expect that one tool should fix them all because they are used to Twitter or used to Facebook, so they want all of these things in one tool, but that's not necessarily how it would be, because back in the day you used one service for publishing, one service for reading, and a couple of services for aggregation, and I think that's maybe where we're heading towards again. And there's a couple of features, or to try to look at again at how we would build the microblog. There's a couple of features that we would need. We need to have a microblog experience. We need to post new posts. We need to be able to reply to posts by others. We of course need to be notified of mentions and replies, and this is, I mean, especially since our smartphones got push notifications, this is really key and has really become one of the main features of Twitter, to be able to get a real-time notification when something happens. Of course, for retweet, we need to be able to share posts by others. We need to have profiles. That's also a very key part to Twitter. People often link to their Twitter profiles. Of course, we need to be able to read posts. We need to have a stream of posts from people one follows. And if we want to rebuild the microblog today, we also need something that works here and now. We can't build something that eventually would work in 10 years because making a business case or just making a case for one of one's friends to participate in something that might not work today, but might perhaps, in the best case scenario, work in 5 years. One can't convince some people about that. But let's see how the IndieWeb solves this. So this is an interface from an IndieWeb editor. This is how you post a new post using the Quill editor. And this is from one of the major IndieWeb participants. And this looks very similar to Medium. This is actually a Medium clone that provides an entire Medium interface for posting to one's blog. And this is an independent tool. You can use this to publish to any IndieWeb-enabled site. And you do this by implementing Micropub, the IndieWeb Micropub standard for your blog or for your site. The Micropub standard, which is now part of a social web working group of W3C as well, it enables third-party clients to post to your site. It does so using OAuth2 and IndieAuth based authentication. And currently it's implemented as it has been implemented with Twitter-like post and reply interfaces. This has also been implemented in some of the Indie readers, so that you can, just like with Twitter, reply straight in, reply from inline in your reader. As we saw, there's a Medium-like editor for it. There are some iOS extensions that can post using Micropub, and I myself am currently building an API on top of Jekyll and GitHub Pages because I want to make things hard for myself that can post to my Jekyll blog on GitHub Pages through a Micropub API. And I thought that we could take a quick look on how that can work in practice. This is a video where I go to, I replied to a blog post on iOS. It opened up an editor with that very URL. I said I wanted to publish it using Micropub, and it published it. Updated it with some metadata, and now we'll see that now this is getting techy, but we can fix the UX later on. And we can see that it actually added a commit to my GitHub repository, and this here is the file of that commit. So this was all happened on my iPhone. I made a reply, and it published a new file on my Jekyll blog that was GitHub then later rebuilt and published on my GitHub Pages site. So no running code on my servers except this Micropub API that I have built. So it works. For UX-wise, this is very much a prototype because I don't build iOS apps. So this is using existing iOS apps. It's an extension for the workflow app and the editorial app that mixed together enables this. But Micropub is just one part. The biggest one that I have been part of is in the IndieWeb sphere is receiving mentions. There's a standard called Web Mention. That's a successor to the pingback trackback standard that was very successful amongst the many blogs. But now actually the creator, pingback succeeded trackback, and now actually the creator of pingback has moved on to Web Mentions himself. So Web Mention is kind of the new way of notifying someone that you have mentioned their URL. And that enables receiving of mentions and notifications about activities of others. If I make a reply to a blog post and I send a web mention to that blog post about my reply, then that other site will know, okay, Pelle has mentioned them, and it can parse out some metadata about it and present it. And when combined with Microformats 2, it can replicate Twitter notifications completely and even go beyond that. And currently, there are plugins and services that exist for WordPress and plain HTML sites and so on. And this is an example from my own blog. This is a mention written by Kyle Mahan on his own site. And these two are actually Kyle Mahan and another guy that has liked my post. And it has been, they sent me web mentions, I parsed them, I embedded it on my site in real time, and I parse out their microformat 2 data that said that it was a like and presented them as a like, and when it was a real mention, I presented it as a real mention. And I did that through my web mention service that's available at this address. It's a web mention endpoint as a service that provides a Disqus-like real-time JavaScript embed of mentions of a URL, so one can just like one does with Disqus, one can just put a JavaScript embed on one's website, and one will get a real-time embed of all of the mentions of that site, of that URL. And that makes it very easy to enable web mentions on any website. I do it on my static Jekyll blog that's hosted on GitHub Pages, but if you, for example, use Episerver or some other old school cool system that's built with Java or C# or some other big stuff, then you can use it there as well. You don't need any server-side implementations for it. And for example, one fun fact about this is that it constantly has around at least 30 active real-time connections to it to stream updates to visitors of sites around the net. Next, sharing posts, we can just take a quick look at this by using web actions and the Indie-config standards. We can get buttons for social interactions on posts. That's one of the key things about Twitter, that when you see a tweet, you can press reply, and you can directly reply to that post. You don't have to copy the URL or do some other weird workaround to get that working. You can just do it in line. And this specifically is a hack for polyfilling, what may in the future be part of the browser. But to try out things here and now, we have made it so that if one goes to my blog and press reply, share, and like, and has an Indie-config configuration, then one will get a reply form that opens on one's own site. And if one hasn't got Indie-config set up, then it will fall back to Twitter. So it's a progressive enhancement for decentralized reaction buttons. And about something that works today, the IndieWeb is very much something that works today. Something that's called abbreviated as POSSE is very, very much used in the IndieWeb sphere. It's published on own site, syndicate elsewhere. It's where you publish the first version of a post on your own site, and then when you publish it to Twitter, you include a link to the canonical source. And this is actually something that has been started to be natively supported by, for example, Medium, where they have a native support for this. There's also the opposite, that is PSUS, when, for example, Instagram, you can't publish to Instagram yourself, but you can syndicate what is published on Instagram to your own site. The idea is that your content should always be available on your own site. You should preferably post it first to your own site, but then people will usually consume it on Twitter and other platforms, so of course it should be available there as well, otherwise it won't really be usable today. And there's a service called Brid.gy that is very especially excellent for this, because it actually bridges interactions between IndieWeb and Twitter so that you can get all of the conversations in one place. There's also a service called OwnYourGram that posts all of your Instagram photos back to your own sites using micropub. And here's an example of Brid.gy. These two posts are actually IndieWeb mention posts, but these two posts here are tweets that Brid.gy has sent to Kevin Mark's site. So he's using Brid.gy to ensure that both his conversation on Twitter and his conversation in the IndieWeb sphere is gathered in the same place. For readers, there hasn't happened a lot. There hasn't yet been a lot of development in the indie reader sphere. The IndieWeb still hasn't got very great readers. So far, most of them look like blog readers. But due to the POSSE and Brid.gy, and due to everything being posted to Twitter, Twitter can also be used as a client for now. But there's still lots of work to be done. But technically, something like Tweetbot could be built today. It's just that no one has done it. Apparently, you can build a company around building things like Tweetbot, and people have. But there's lots of interesting things to happen here. Just something to mention is also that there's actually since 2010 or something, a test for interoperability so that I can actually ensure that a social network, this is a independent test for ensuring that there's true interoperability in a decentralized social network. So no matter who creates a decentralized social network, if they can reproduce the SWOT zero, if they can perform the SWOT zero test, then you can actually know that it's in one way or another actually interoperable. And there has been multiple IndieWeb tools that have shown compliance with this. For example, with StatusNet, it was StatusNet and ClickSet that was this startup that later ran out of money and had to shut down. Those two were the very first that proved SWOT zero compatibility, but then there wasn't really any more that proved it. But already in the IndieWeb sphere, we have had multiple tools that have participated in this. My own web mention endpoint is almost ready to participate in this, and I look forward to soon be able to prove that also my endpoint can perform in this. To mention another few technicalities, like microformats 2 that I've already mentioned. This is what one uses to mark up the semantics within the IndieWeb sphere, and we use pub sub above to add real-timeness into the mix. But all in all, I would say that all of these features that I posted took up earlier is actually features that the IndieWeb support. You can post new posts either directly from your own site or through micropub. You can reply to posts by others, for example, by using the Indie-config or Webaction standards. Web mentions and sources, you get notified. You can share things. You get streams. All of this is supported by the IndieWeb, and I also think that the IndieWeb can support all of these cases. We actually have aggregators already in this sphere. There's an indie news site that actually is an aggregator, just like Reddit and Hacker News. Publishing there's plenty of, and there are a few readers, and there are bound to be more. But will it really work? I mean, people have tried on this. People has attempted this lots and lots of times before. Why will this work? If everyone else has failed before, why would this specific attempt work? And the way that I see it is that this movement actually has a focus on doing. All of the other attempts has a focus on standardizing and then doing. So there has been a very nice standard. There has been perhaps one implementation of that standard. Sometimes there hasn't even been a single implementation of the full standard. But here, solutions are first deployed and proven, and only when a solution has actually been deployed and proven and shown useful in the real world, only then is it actually documented and proven and documented and standardized. So all standards within the IndieWeb sphere has been tried and tested and proven to be usable within the real world, and it already has multiple implementations before it is standardized. So unlike other implementations, it already works if it's an IndieWeb standard, whereas other standards has never been proven to work and has ultimately never really worked at all. And it's also this that it actually coexists with the silos. All of the other attempts has tried to recreate new social networks from scratch, and of course, therefore never really provided enough value for anyone to really use. But by building tools that are usable here and now, and by coexisting with the silos rather than revolting against them, IndieWeb tools are usable here and now. And it solves real problems. By self-log feeding and solving personal problems, we really delivers value from scratch and really empowers people to try out their own ideas. This is also really the key. The independence of silos isn't really the main focus of the IndieWeb. The main focus isn't to revolt against Twitter or to revolt against any of them, but the main focus is really to try out new ideas and to empower ourselves to try new things. And if we do this, and if we try successfully, if IndieWeb successfully manages to replicate the entire microblogging experience, as it already it can do it. It just needs to gather some momentum. And if IndieWeb or some other technology manages to produce an independent alternative to Twitter, then we can avoid having Twitter becoming yet another Yaiku. We can avoid ending up with the entire community being scattered, and we can progressively move people away from having Twitter as their main profiles to having IndieWeb profiles being their main profiles. So we might, when Twitter eventually dies, because we can probably all acknowledge that Twitter will one day die, but when it does, we hopefully can have moved back and back home and have our identities on our own sites again. By then we have hopefully become our own, and when we have become our own, then no one can close us down. So growth or no growth, we can still very much be alive, we can still very much do what we want to do, and there will really be no rest in peace of each of our own profiles, because if we really manages to move away from these silos and really build our own independent sphere, then we would be independent and we would really be sustainable for as long as we want. As long as we want to blog or want to continue to use the microblogs, if we make them our own, then they will be there and they will be sustainable for real for as long as we want, and then we would really be independent for real. Yeah, that was pretty much it. Thanks.